Professor Miller, Teachers College, faculty and students, heads of school, K through 12 teachers, and distinguished guests. First, I want to thank Professor Miller for that very warm and generous introduction and say what a joy and how exciting it has been to work with her over the last 3 years. And I also would mention that the partnership with Frank Peabody, who's a former businessman and gifted artist, has made this a remarkable experience for me. Now, it's a special honor for me to be here with all of you this afternoon, and it's also heartwarming to see such a great turnout for this conference. What brings us together is a shared commitment to education for the whole child, body, mind, heart, and spirit. Through movements like holistic education, social and emotional learning, character education, and spirituality in education, many of you have been working for a decade, 2 decades, even longer, on creative ways to make this worthy ideal a reality for children in our schools. You are beacons of light and hope, and I hope you never forget that. There are many different ways to approach this challenge and many outstanding models. I also hope that in the course of the next 2 days, we'll explore together opportunities for collaboration and perhaps for future movement building. At the outset, I do want to thank the CSE team who organized this gathering, beginning, of course, with Professor Miller, whose visionary leadership is the driving force behind this event. I extend deep appreciation to Karen Bart, CSE's Executive Director, and to Lisa Rosenstein, the manager of the conference, and to Meredith Kaplan. And I want to say special thanks to the advisory committee and all who have helped put this event together. Now, some of you may wonder how a long-retired religion professor wound up here at Teachers College talking about education for the whole child. A few comments about that. I was raised in a liberal Protestant Christian home, which had a lasting influence on my ethical values. However, spiritually, it was experiences in nature that stirred me most deeply as a boy. During my college years, I found myself in the midst of a personal spiritual quest for an understanding of the deeper meaning of life and also a search for an understanding of America's national purpose. I was eventually led to enroll in Union Theological Seminary, followed by doctoral studies at Columbia University. What I learned during those years about the history of the world's religions and Western philosophy was priceless and invaluable. But I also gradually became acutely aware that a purely intellectual understanding was not by itself the answer that I was looking for. I was seeking ways to internalize the wisdom that I was studying, and that involves encountering and experiencing the truth with one's whole being. I remember at a particularly difficult time in my early life, back then, trying to explain what I was going through to my cousin. And finally she looked at me and said, "I don't care what you think, I want to know what you feel." And that hit the nail on the head. I soon found myself entering into psychoanalysis, and eventually I turned to the Rochester Zen Center and plunged into a rigorous contemplative practice. These disciplines had a huge impact. In this way, I opened myself up to the transformative experiences and inner growth that I was looking for. The spiritual journey has been ongoing ever since. Now, given my background, when my friend Frank Peabody introduced me to Lisa Miller, and the scientific research in her book, The Spiritual Child, I got very interested. What Professor Miller was proposing involved a radical transformation of public school education in America, but her thinking had scientific support, and the troubled times called for radical interventions. The three of us started an extended dialogue, as Lisa has explained, and in 2017, we launched the Collaborative. Now, we come together at a time when our democratic republic is in a state of crisis. The nation is badly fragmented and divided. There is a steep decline among Americans of a unifying sense of shared values and national identity. Our federal government's unable to address fundamental and urgent social, economic, and environmental problems. One shocking symptom of the dysfunction in government and the pathology in our culture is the failure of our nation, with all its resources, to protect children in schools from gun violence. A lack of trust in the nation's institutions, cynicism, fear, anger, and despair are widespread, and as Professor Miller noted, suicide is on the rise. Among children, this is especially worrisome. America today is a nation in search of its soul. We need to recover a sense of shared values and common purpose as a people. In short, we need to rediscover and recommit ourselves to the animating spirit of our democracy, which can once again serve as an inspiring, healing, and unifying force. If this is going to happen, it will take time, and the schools and education for the whole child will have a critical role to play. Rachel Kessler, a leader of the SEL movement and founder of PassageWorks, in her visionary book, The Soul of Education, provides a concise statement that recognizes the interrelationship of democracy, holistic education, and spiritual development. She writes, if we are educating for wholeness, for citizenship, and for leadership in a democracy, spiritual development belongs in schools. This afternoon, I'll endeavor to make the case that holistic education, including spiritual development, is needed in our schools to support and nurture attitudes, values, and beliefs that are at the heart of the American democratic ideal and way of life. The nation's founding vision of the ideal reflects universal human aspirations and values. The reality that is American society has in many ways stood in contradiction to that vision. However, the vision remains profoundly meaningful and a force driving change. Educating for wholeness, to use Kessler's words, and spirituality in education means taking our nation's democratic values to heart and building a pervasive culture in every school that reflects these values and inspires a shared faith in the vision. Think of it as educating young people for responsible freedom and for compassionate leadership in a democratic society designed to support both the individual pursuit of happiness and the common good. Now, before exploring further with you the close interconnection between spiritual development and the deeper meaning of democracy, I want to just say a few words about the relationship between spirituality and religion. It is common in America for people to identify spirituality with religion, and this leads many to think that given the First Amendment, the separation of church and state, spirituality has no place in the public schools. I have some, yeah. These concerns lead many educators and others to shy away from the use of the words spirituality and spiritual development. I respect this perspective, and it may be necessary in certain situations to avoid talk about spirituality. However, CSE uses the terms because it is the simplest way to refer to an essential development dimension of education for the whole child. Now, when supporting spirituality in education, the concern is with spiritual development understood as a natural human capacity. This universal innate capacity is an integral dimension of human development, and it provides a much-needed foundation of meaning and purpose for a young person's cognitive, emotional, social, moral, and aesthetic, physical development. Now, spirituality and religion are interrelated, but they are not identical. This inborn capacity can be nurtured both within and apart from institutional religion. Over the centuries, there have been many philosophers, poets, and others who have celebrated spiritual experiences and promoted spiritual development apart from organized religion. Socrates and Plato, of course, are the prime example. Wordsworth's poetry, Emerson's transcendentalist philosophy, and John Dewey's naturalistic theory of the religious dimension of experience, these are all examples. The spiritual child deepens our understanding of what this means with regard to children and adolescents. So in every human being, as Professor Miller has indicated, there is a deep inner core that forms the center of the feeling, thinking, willing human being. In this regard, spiritual traditions refer to the soul or spirit, and the term heart is widely used. Spirituality in education is about caring for the hearts as well as the minds of young people. It takes seriously the yearning of young hearts for deep connection, belonging, self-expression, meaning, purpose, and joy. Spiritual development in schools involves supporting and nurturing the blossoming of a young person's being or spirit. Our being is the spirit, the attitudes and qualities of character that moves and motivates us, shaping our relationship with ourselves, other persons, nature, and the mystery of being. People, including young people, grow spiritually by being more, by opening their minds and hearts to the world. It is all about the awakening of wonder, caring, creativity, compassion, and love. This is where spiritual development intersects with the ethics of democracy. As a general rule, young children are in touch with their heart and enjoy a certain innocence and innate spiritual awareness. They spontaneously greet the world with wonder, yearn to grow and learn, experience empathy with others. However, many lose touch with their innermost being as the years pass and their spiritual life is shut down. The fault is often with education at home and in the school, as well as with the larger cultural environment. This is a tragedy because a growing body of scientific research, as Professor Miller has outlined today, has demonstrated a healthy spiritual life not only supports academic learning, it's essential to individual development, resilience, and thriving. This new science is changing the conversation and by itself provides a compelling argument in support of calls for spiritual development in the schools. Spiritual development is also needed in our schools to support the democratic spirit itself. We tend to think of democracy as just a political system, but it is much more. Democracy in America is best understood as first and foremost a great moral ideal and way of life. Moral democracy, or what some philosophers call spiritual democracy, is the only secure foundation for political democracy. Coming to this understanding as a graduate student at Columbia University, studying the writings of John Dewey, America's foremost philosopher during the early decades of the 20th century, was for me a real awakening. It opened a way to integrate spiritual life and everyday life in modern, industrial, secular society. Now, the founders of the American Republic contended that their experiment in creating a free self-governing society could only succeed if it had a moral and spiritual foundation. Their commitment to freedom reflects a certain basic faith in human nature. However, they were well aware of the influence of the passions and self-interest, and they knew all too well that power corrupts. They firmly believed that freedom without self-discipline and a high sense of social and moral responsibility was unsustainable. In their judgment, the new nation would require leaders with exceptional intelligence and moral integrity and an educated citizenry with an awakened conscience. It was widely thought at the time that human beings have a natural capacity for empathy, for sympathy, and for benevolence. But these moral and altruistic feelings have to be carefully nurtured and supported. In this regard, the founders looked to religion, families, and the schools as having critical roles to play. James Madison, the chief drafter of the Constitution, declared that the public good, the real welfare of the great body of the people, is the supreme object to be pursued. The founders considered the essence of responsible political leadership and civic virtue to be devotion to the common good and a readiness to sacrifice self-interest for the public interest. In short, the creation of America as a democratic republic was understood by the founders to be a great moral undertaking. Now, in the midst of cultural and religious diversity, what united the American people in 1776 was a revolutionary faith in moral and political ideals. It is this faith that defines an American as an American and forms our national identity. One can, of course, deplore the history of slavery and racial prejudice, the oppression of Native Americans, the inequality of women, and other ways the reality of American society has contradicted the nation's ideals, and at the same time embrace the democratic faith and the American experiment. Langston Hughes, the Harlem Renaissance poet, makes this point and spoke for all marginalized groups when he wrote, "Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be, the land it never has been yet, and yet must be. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." The schools have a critical role to play in making the original dream a reality. Now, philosophers, poets, and social activists like Walt Whitman, John Dewey, Jane Addams, and Martin Luther King have all understood the foundation of America's political democracy to be moral or spiritual democracy. Dewey, the leader of the progressive education movement, declared, and I quote, "Democracy is a moral ideal, and so far as it becomes a fact, is a moral fact." He said that in 1938 at the celebration of his 80th birthday. For Dewey, democracy was most fundamentally, and these are his words, a personal way of individual life that involves possession and continued use of certain attitudes, forming personal character and determining desire and purpose in all the relations of life. For Dewey, living the democratic life should go on in the home, in the school, in the workplace, as well as in politics and in government. Wholehearted commitment to the democratic faith, contended Dewey, can have a unifying effect on a person's life that he described as spiritual in quality. Moreover, he called for creating schools with a democratic culture and ethos that cultivated, and these are his words, growth in mind and spirit, and planted the seeds of just such a faith. Now, the principal ideals and values associated with American democracy are set forth in the opening sections of the Declaration of Independence and in the preamble of the Constitution. These are relatively brief texts, but they have deep roots in over 3,000 years of Western spiritual, moral, and political development. There are 5 principles that form the core moral ideal at the heart of American democracy: freedom, equality, human rights, justice, and the common good. Freedom is a universal human value. The great spiritual and religious traditions are centrally concerned with personal inner liberation and with social liberation. Freedom is America's most cherished ideal, celebrated in the nation's statues of liberty and in song, sermons, protests, and political rhetoric. However, the critical question is, what is the meaning of freedom? In what sense is it a supreme spiritual ideal? There is negative freedom, freedom from restraint, and positive freedom, what one chooses to use one's freedom for. How people conceive positive freedom makes all the difference. If individual freedom is identified primarily with negative freedom, the absence of restraint, and is reduced to a self-centered, atomistic individualism, which is all too common in American culture, it can undermine efforts to promote equality, justice, and the common good. And if you look at this diagram, then you see the tension that exists between individual freedom and the common good and justice. When this happened, the bonds of community fray, the strong exploit the weak, the natural environment is degraded, and wealth and power are concentrated in the hands of the few. Democracy is corrupted, spiritual emptiness spreads. Now, in the American tradition, it's the principle of equality that provides a basic moral framework that demands rights for the poor and minorities, opportunity and justice for all, and promotion of the common good. The core ethical principle related to the democratic ideal of equality is stated concisely in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And that concept is the most radical concept to be released in the world over the last 200 years. As a political as well as a moral ideal. Now, the roots of the American ideal of equality are found in biblical religion and the idea that all human beings are created in the image of God and possess immeasurable intrinsic value. In this ancient worldview, there's something sacred about each and every person. This outlook inspired prophetic calls to treat others with a certain equal moral consideration and with justice. The Bible's golden rule states the general ethical principle: in everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, this universal ethical principle invites us, in the midst of all our differences, to identify with the other as a person with whom we share a common humanity and who, like us, seeks happiness and wants to avoid suffering. It encourages an attitude of empathy, sympathy, and compassion. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the theological language is gone, but the spirit of the ancient ideal remains. It is the call to recognize the ignored, protect the vulnerable, build the cooperative working relationships and compassionate connections that can hold together a multicultural society. So many of the problems with which America is dealing today, from racism and religious intolerance to sexual harassment to economic inequality to hate-filled partisan political conflict, are rooted in a failure to recognize and honor the inherent and equal dignity of the other. Freedom and equality are at the core of the animating spirit of the American democratic ideal. Together, these two principles call for being more and a relational spirituality, for compassion, for human rights and justice, and for a politics of the common good. It challenges all Americans to use their freedom to develop themselves so they can contribute according to their distinct abilities to the common good. Education of the whole child, including spiritual development, is needed in our public and independent schools in order to support realization of these foundational democratic ideals and universal human values. This includes building school systems with diversity that are supported by an equitable distribution of essential resources and that fairly compensate teachers for the extraordinary contributions they make to society. The first principle of our philosophy of education should be seeing and welcoming each and every child as a young person with inherent dignity, full of unique potential, whose birthright as a human being is freedom, and who is worthy of our society's love, care, and protection. Together with academic learning, our schools should be places where the child finds the conditions, a social climate that nurtures the blossoming of the spirit, which is her being. A school culture that inspires being more plants the seeds of responsible freedom and compassionate leadership that our democracy so urgently needs in all spheres, in families, civil society, business, politics, and government. Awakening and strengthening in young people the capacity for inner freedom is especially important. When describing in what the dignity of the human being consists, the democratic tradition often cites reason and conscience. In this regard, the capacity for independent critical thought and freedom of choice is fundamental, especially the ability to choose what kind of a person I want to be, want to become, and to be. This inner spiritual freedom emerges from our deep inner core. The Stoic philosophers called it the last freedom and consider it to be the deepest source of human dignity. We have little control over how other people in our lives behave and over most of what happens in the world around us. However, the last freedom is something no one can take away. It is the capacity to choose one's attitude in whatever circumstances life thrusts us. When put in prison during civil rights protests, Martin Luther King would fast and pray in order to strengthen his inner freedom and his resolve not to give in to the hate that led his captors to imprison him. The only sure defense of democratic values and institutions when they're under attack is the inner freedom, way of being, and courage of individual citizens. Now, any discussion in the 21st century about spiritual democracy, spirituality and education, and the common good is incomplete without emphasizing the significance of our relationship to nature. As many of you know, encounters with nature awaken in young people powerful spiritual experiences involving wonder, awe, beauty, and joy, and can leave them with a lifelong mystical sense of belonging to the universe and of reverence for the mystery of being. A spiritually supportive school will strive to create conditions and experiences that nurture intimacy with nature. Supporting in young people an appreciation of the intrinsic value of the larger natural world is also vitally important. Humanity is an interdependent member of the greater community of life on Earth, and the degradation of the environment puts the future of human civilization at risk. The survival of the human species may well hinge on the expansion of our ethical consciousness to include a sense of global interdependence and respect and care for the greater community of life in all its diversity. This, too, is why our industrial technological civilization needs spiritual development in the schools. A very good teaching tool on how to integrate democratic and ecological values is found in the Earth Charter. And Lisa has already mentioned that to you, and I believe many of you have copies of the Earth Charter. and I would encourage you to consider it as a very useful teaching tool that integrates democratic and ecological values and presents a vision of widely shared values for building a just, sustainable, and peaceful world. So in conclusion, the challenges we face today are hugely complex. Educating for wholeness, including spiritual development, is essential for the well-being of individual children, for renewing the soul of America in these troubled times, and for finding promising pathways to a just and sustainable future. Our nation's schools should be places where the inner spirit, the core of their humanity, the inner spirit of children is able to grow, blossom, and flourish. And this is the great challenge. And again, I say to all of you who are working to promote these goals, you're beacons of hope and light in a very troubled time. Thank you very much.